is obvious, the most simple-minded, that Loci is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your argument strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I am chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
Captain's log. Star date 11 February. Another time, Harrods. Israel's far-right minister says he's a fascist homophobe but won't stone gays. This is a January 16th report. Bezalel Smotrich, definitely want to keep a pen in this with him and his name, wherein there's a ton of information just recently about Palestine moving from occupation to annexation, as if it already hasn't. 3 indicators demonstrate the annexation is already occurring, and even if Israel is attempting to evade its consequences by deferring a declaration to a more opportune moment, first, the new government's founding documents indicate a clear and dramatic pivot in the organizing normative framework with which it's administering the territories, from the law of occupation to an application of Israeli domestic law. This is justsecurity.org. One clear example of this shift, let me make this a little larger for you. One clear example of this shift is an agreed change to the enemy property law, which will release property in the West Bank that was held by Israelis prior to 1948 back into their hands. The change in legal policy echoes a similar move made upon the annexation of East Jerusalem in 1967, signifies a determination that the temporary state of occupation has ended and that the territory is assimilated into the Israeli legal system. Second, the new government's agreed to implement several significant structural changes. A constitutional change already made facilitated the appointment of a second Minister of Defense, who's assumed responsibility for the military units managing civilian life in the West Bank. The coordination of government activities, COGAT, and the civilian administration, as well as the authority to appoint their heads. Importantly, the new minister considers himself committed first and foremost to advancing the interests of Israeli settlers. Furthermore, the government agreed to transfer the authority of the legal advisors to these bodies from the military, the IDF Central Command, to the civilian Israeli Defense Ministry. Importantly, throughout the decades of Israel rule in the territories, these legal advisors were responsible for ensuring that the occupied territories are managed in accordance with the international law of occupation. This change is coupled with the determination that the Defense Ministry's legal position on issues raised before the Supreme Court requires the approval of the minister, diminishing the independent professional discretion of government lawyers. It should further be evaluated against the government's radical transformative plan to undermine the binding status of government legal advisors' opinions, abolish judicial review, eliminate the constitutional basis for human rights, and assert unchecked power, which will allow it to entrench itself. These organizational changes transfer authority from the military commander entrusted by the law of occupation with governing the occupied territories to the hands of the civilian government of the occupying state. It therefore serves as strong evidence of changing the legal status of the West Bank from an occupation to annexation. And all these changes have already happened. So there's this groundswell, just like we heard in the Lula story, that democracy, all of these, outlets saying that there's something having to do with democracy happening. The term now that we're hearing is that the U.S. is standing up against annexation. Too late. Finally, the transfer of authority. Oh, my apologies. Hold on. Too late. Finally, the transfer of authority also reflects a change in the symbolic performance of power. From uniformed military legal advisors seated in the West Bank to civilian lawyers presumably seated in Tel Aviv. From a historic openness to a two-state solution where a Palestinian state coexists side by side with Israel subject to permanent status negotiations, to a declaration that the land in its entirety is the object of the exclusive and indisputable right of Israel. We therefore conclude that Israel is presently effectuating changes which qualify as de jure annexation of the West Bank. Its deference of a formal declaration of annexation cannot serve to refute this conclusion. It is a simple attempt at gaslighting. And here's Noura Erakat, a Palestinian activist, on the current situation in Palestine.
Thank you so much, Becky. I appreciate centering that question and what it feels like to be a Palestinian, because so much of what's at stake is actually our dehumanization and the expendability of our lives, livelihoods, that our deaths become numbers rather than vanished dreams and mourning families. As I'm watching this, I'm having intense emotions. I was in Jerusalem in 2000 at the start of what's known as the Second Palestinian Intifada. I was there when one of the first of the 5 people killed on September 21, 2000 was one of my neighbors in Abu Dis. I remember vividly his toddler daughter beating on a picture of him, calling for her Baba. I'm also then reminded immediately of my cousin who was murdered last summer at a checkpoint separating 2 Palestinian cities. Ahmed Erakat, I want to lift up his name because he remains in captivity in an Israeli refrigerator at Tel Aviv University, held as hostage, and not allowing his family, my family, to mourn him with dignity. I'm now bracing myself because on the one hand, I am invigorated by what is a Palestinian uprising against this colonial rule, and simultaneously bracing myself because I understand and see that Palestinian death has become an index for Israeli vulnerability because of the thorough dehumanization of our lives.
What we are witnessing today and overnight is this uptick in, I don't want to call it tit-for-tat strikes from Gaza and then on the back end from Israel, because tit-for-tat just dismisses the enormity of what is going on. But this has come off the back of recent violence in Jerusalem. And in a recent op-ed, you said, and I quote, Sheikh Jarrah is the latest flashpoint of Israel's expansionist project. The threats of eviction are part of what Palestinians describe as their ongoing Nakba. You wrote in that
violent juridical demarcations and its settler colonial plans of dividing Palestinians and eliminating them as a people, she cannot travel to Jerusalem, and instead, like me, is watching it from afar despite her proximity. I heard the interview with Mark Regev. I had a lot to say to him, especially as he was sharing propaganda that Jerusalem has been the home to what he described as Arabs, he should have described as Palestinians, despite the fact that the Israeli government has been explicit about removing Palestinians. In its Jerusalem Master Plan of 2000, it says explicitly that it wants to maintain a demographic majority of Jews of 70% to 30%, and needs to do that because natural population growth of Palestinians will become 60 to 40. And so they have pursued a policy of removal through state annexation, through forced evictions, through retroactive taxes, through the declaration of land as state parks that are now off limits to Palestinians. 14,000 Palestinians have had their residency permits revoked since 1967 without due process. When Israel annexed Jerusalem in full daylight in contravention of international condemnation and 19 policy of removal through state annexation, through forced evictions, through retroactive taxes, through the declaration of land as state park removal, through state annexation, through forced evictions, 60 to 40. And so they have pursued a policy of removal through state annexation, through forced evictions, through retroactive taxes, through the declaration of land as state parks that are now off limits to Palestinians. 14,000 Palestinians have had the residency permits revoked since 1967 without due process. When Israel annexed Jerusalem in full daylight in contravention of international condemnation in 1967.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
These are facts. They're numbers. You can. These are facts. They're numbers. These are facts. They're numbers. You can quantify this.
Expanded Jerusalem's municipal boundaries by 10 times and annexed some 17,000 additional West Bank acres of West Bank land. Since then, the Israeli government has built some 49,000 housing units for Jewish Zionists in Jerusalem, but not a single one for Palestinians who constitute a third of the city's population. Nothing here speaks of equality. This is a settler colonial campaign to remove native Palestinians and to replace them with Jewish Zionist settlers in their place. Every Palestinian removed today from their home is not suffering from a real estate dispute, but faces their life now as a refugee for the rest of their life.
The rockets that are being fired by Hamas from Gaza, they say, are in response to what is going on in Sheikh Jarrah and in response to the violence, they say, that Israel has waged against worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque over the past couple of days, over the Middle East weekend.
I do think it's important to note that it's the democratically elected Hamas.
Do you support that response by Hamas? This is an organization that many will say is filling a void where otherwise a wider Palestinian leadership might be. It's no secret that there has been a vacuum in Palestinian so at this point.
Unfortunately, I think that the focus on Hamas rockets.
That's sad that how propagandized that is.
Which have been ineffective. Israel has protected itself with the Iron Dome system. Hamas has crude rocket fire that does not have the ability to target, is ipso facto reckless, and indicates the deep asymmetry in this conflict, which we should emphasize, which is a maldistribution of power that cannot be reduced to false parities. And oftentimes when I'm asked this question about how I feel about this rocket fire, it's a litmus test about my own moral compass. So here, let me affirm that Palestinians have the right to use force under international law in order to fend off that Palestinians have the right to use force under international law in order to fend off racial discrimination and colonial regimes. This law and this right is enshrined in a moment where the majority of the world was under colonial rule and domination. Now that we're in 2021, that seems incredibly anachronistic. And rather than focus on the absurdity that this colonialism remains intact by one of the 11th most military powers in the world, the only nuclear power in the Middle East. Instead, we are focusing on the tactics that Palestinians are using. That said, I think that the emphasis should be on lifting the siege on Gaza. They remain in an open-air prison, and as Israel now initiates a bombardment of the Gaza Strip, I want the audience to know that Palestinians cannot even become refugees of war because Israel has sealed those borders.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
Essentially, that's what Noura Erakat just said to the host. Your inconsistencies, I mean, the idea that with all of that violence propagated by the Israeli government, focusing on Hamas is preposterous. Absolutely preposterous.
Where is the United States in all of this? House.
Broadly speaking, obvious.
Position has remained consistent when it became Israel's primary patron in 1967 under the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, where it talks out of both sides of its mouth by providing unequivocal military economic support to Israel at the same time that it offers empty platitudes about peace and the two-state solution, which is essentially a liberal veneer for Israel's settler colonial expansion and violence. The Biden administration has signaled that it is no different than the Trump administration, which the world, was uproarious about because of his flagrant, brazen violence and disrespect of human rights. And yet the Biden administration has not changed course. When Trump moved the embassy, the U.S. embassy, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the world was uproarious, and Palestinians said, we're not mourning the loss of a capital of an inchoate state. We are now mourning the fact that we are told that we don't belong. And here is the Biden administration literally overseeing our removal based on the statement that we do not belong there and can be removed and placed anywhere else.
With that,